My name is Phil Catanzano, and I'm here to talk to you today about sexual misconduct and the duty of responsible employees. We have a lot to cover in the next hour or so. I have to tell you a little bit about what the Conservatory's sexual misconduct policy is, and as an overview, policy here is that sexual misconduct will not be tolerated by the Conservatory. To help you understand how that works and what your important role is in that process, you have to understand first the relevant law. The relevant law isn't what necessarily you're charged with understanding or following. You certainly have to know about it and you certainly have to do your part. But more important than that, I really want to make clear to you what the Conservatory's policy is and how that impacts you. Because you have a very specific role here. Your role is to report information that may be sexually inappropriate that you learn about. And so to do that, I need to share with you what the prohibited conduct is. That is, what is the conduct that the Conservatory says will not be tolerated here? Finally, in this section, I'll talk to you about how the policy works and what you can expect if you're either a party in the process or if one of your students or your colleagues are. Next, we'll talk about exactly what the roles and duties of a responsible employee are, and you are a responsible employee by virtue of your having to listen to this. I want you to understand what your job is, and I want you to think through some challenging situations that you might come across. Finally, for the second half of this presentation, we'll talk about appropriate boundaries, and how do you understand the challenges and the power dynamics that typically lead to unhealthy relationships. In my experience, I see that boundary issues are often the situations that lead to violations of an institution's sexual misconduct policy. Importantly, this policy is not just designed for students, even though I will talk about students and faculty frequently. This is a broader obligation that the institution is saying applies to all of their faculty, staff, and employees. So if you are a student or an employee or a faculty member and you feel that you're being subjected to or you learn about sexually inappropriate behavior, the Conservatory wants to know. The first thing to understand is what is the law that we're talking about here? And the answer to that is that there are actually many laws that say that sexual misconduct is bad, is inappropriate, is sometimes criminal in nature. There are criminal codes that we won't talk about today, but the one law we will talk a little bit about, at least at the beginning, is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Title IX states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now take a look at that definition. Notice that nowhere in that definition does it say the word woman or female or girl. And that's a common misperception that people have across the country. They believe that Title IX is only in place to protect women or a specific gender. And in fact, the law in the Conservatory's policy is much broader than that. If you experience sexually inappropriate behavior and you're a man, or you're a woman, or you are any other gender identity or status, you are protected by this law and you're protected by the Conservatory's policy. So understand that. Understand that this is a broad definition. This is a broad law, and the policy is designed to capture all of the content that could happen, regardless of your sex or your gender identity. Now that you understand where the policy is, you have to understand what the policy is and why it is that you're listening to this today. You're listening to this because you are an individual that both the law and the Conservatory has designated as a responsible employee. And that kind of means what it sounds like. You're an employee that has been given a responsibility. And here, that's defined as an employee who, number 2, has been given the duty of reporting incidents of sexual violence or any other misconduct by students to the Title IX coordinator. The Conservatory has decided that you, as an individual, are best placed to inform if there's any sexually inappropriate behavior. And the law views it the same way. The law views it as you are in a position where you're going to be most likely to get the information. And as soon as you get information about sexual misconduct, the institution as a whole is on notice. So if you don't share the information, the government and the courts and the law still hold the institution liable, but they might never know if you don't tell anyone. And so responsible employee requirement is that if you learn of anything that could even implicate the policy, you don't need to prove that it actually happened. You don't need to investigate it. In fact, I'm going to tell you repeatedly that you don't need to investigate these matters. All you need to know is that you need to report it. And this is designed to help you because by reporting it, you're taking a burden that you might carry alone, something that someone shared with you, a behavior that someone said happened to them that really didn't feel right to them. And instead of carrying that alone or trying to support the individual alone, you have an entire team behind you. It's the Title IX team that I just mentioned. Nick Mackey and Ashley Carter can be there as a resource for you and a resource for the person because at bottom, that is the most important thing, to make sure the people who are suffering from this behavior can be helped as expediently as possible. Importantly, all faculty and staff are responsible employees at the Conservatory. You must report. In order to place that onus on you and to say that you have to report when there's any sexually inappropriate behavior, you have to have a sense of what that behavior looks like and what it could mean. The policy itself spells this out in detail, and so I encourage you to read the policy and understand what the prohibited conduct is. But let's walk through a few of the more common examples that come from that list of prohibited conduct. First is sexual assault or rape. Many people think they have an understanding of what sexual assault or rape look like, and they do. They have that understanding because of the media and because of television and movies that always paint a picture of sexual assault or rape in somewhat consistent ways. It's typically a large, scary man who does something terrible to a vulnerable woman. But that's not all it is. It's more than just the scary scenario that happens in an alley. That certainly happens. And when it happens, it's wrong, it's inappropriate, and will be adjudicated both in this process and potentially in criminal court. But here, under the conservatory's policy, the definition is broader than that. The definition is actual or attempted sexual contact with another person without that person's consent. That last word is the most important, consent. And many of the cases that I work on, it's not the scenario that is described here. It's not a scenario of a stranger coming and doing something awful to another person. And it's not typically just a man versus a woman where it's happening. It can happen in any way, shape, or form. It can happen between two male partners or two female partners or two other partners of any other gender identity. The important part is that it's behavior that occurs without an individual's consent. Commonly, it's not that they've chosen not to consent to anything. Many times, individuals consent to certain sexual activities. They may consent to activity 1 and consent to activity number 2. But they didn't consent to activity number 3, and one of the partners chooses to do that act anyway. At that point, Act 1 and Act 2 are not sexual assault or rape, but the Act 3 that was not consented to could be. So I say this just so you understand that sexual assault and rape is much bigger, and it's much more broadly defined than you might see in the media or in the movies or television. And it's important that you understand that because you are on the front line who might have to acknowledge that. And the individual who comes to you might never say the word sexual assault or rape. And so you just need to make that determination based on what you see, what you hear, and what they have described to you. Another common example of prohibited conduct that the conservatory wants to stamp out is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is defined as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that has the effect of creating a hostile living, learning, or working environment. Now that's important. Remember, I explained at the beginning, this is not just about students, even though many of it is written in student terms. This is about anyone who lives, learns, or works within the conservatory's environment. And as such, you're protected from sexually harassing behavior. Sexually harassing behavior is defined as conduct that is sufficiently severe and/or pervasive so as to limit or deny a person's ability to participate in the conservatory's education or employment. The important words there are severe and/or pervasive. The courts and the federal government has said that a single instance of rape or sexual assault is severe enough to constitute sexual harassment or a sexually hostile environment. But there's also that other word, pervasive. Pervasive means behavior that occurs over and over and over again, such that it makes people feel uncomfortable or makes them feel like they cannot work or live or learn here at the conservatory. So what could that be? It does not need to be physical. Instead, it could be relatively innocent in a vacuum. Hey, I like your shirt. Or hey, I really like that skirt you're wearing today. You should show off your legs more. Why don't we go out for a cup of coffee or dinner together? That's a good idea. Let's go for dinner together next weekend. To the extent that that behavior is unwanted, unwelcomed, and continually persists, that makes it uncomfortable for a person to go to school or to work or to take an overnight shift, for example. They know that every time I work with the shift, I'm going to run into that creep who's going to comment upon my body or some other aspect of me in a sexual manner. To the extent that that happens either in a severe context, mean sexual assault or rape or anything like that, or in a pervasive manner where it's just words or comments that are repeated over and over and over again. Both of those things could constitute sexual harassment, and as such, the conservatory has taken a strong line that they will not be tolerated here. Finally, there's another issue of sexual exploitation. Sexual exploitation is taking sexual advantage of another person for the benefit of anyone other than that person. That also can come up in a variety of different ways. Again, oftentimes this takes place in a situation in which consent has been given for one activity. One example that I provided about this behavior is an instance in which a student consents to sexual activity. They consent to have sex with another person. But then in the course of having sex with them, they look over and they notice that there's videotape rolling, that they're being taped. They might not have consented to being taped. And if the individual shares that video and they haven't consented to that, then that's another instance of sexual exploitation. While the individual act of sex was consented to, the videotaping and the sharing of that videotape may not be consented to. That could constitute sexual exploitation. In addition to those behaviors that are sexual in nature, there's also behaviors that are not clearly sexual in nature but may have that same context in the situation. So for example, stalking. Stalking is defined as more than one instance of inappropriate and unwanted attention, harassment, threatening or intimidating physical or verbal contact, or any other course of conduct directed at a person that could reasonably be regarded as likely to alarm or place that person in fear of harm or injury, including physical, emotional, or psychological harm. Again, Hollywood does us a bit of a disservice here because when Hollywood portrays stalking, it's typically a large, scary man stalking a vulnerable woman. That's not the way it necessarily has to look, and in fact, there are many forms of stalking. Here's a typical example. A person in your class comes to you and says, I just went out with this woman last night and we had a great time. We hooked up a little bit. But then when I got home, I found out I had 15 missed calls from her. And then she emailed me and texted me another 25 times. And this morning I woke up and even though she doesn't have anything to do with the conservatory, I found her waiting by my office. That's a situation in which, even though the individual never said stalking and they never portrayed it as you might see it in the movies, that could be an example in which that person is being subjected to stalking. There's more than one instance of inappropriate conduct that, even though there's not a physical element to it, may cause or be intended to cause emotional or psychological harm. Another example that you may see, and may be really challenging to determine and figure out what's actually happening, is relationship violence. The definition of relationship violence extends to dating and domestic violence, and it also includes this: abuse, violence, or intentionally controlling behavior between partners or former partners. It may involve bodily injury, emotional abuse, or purposely causing apprehension of bodily injury or property damage. It also includes unwanted communications. Now, when you learn about behavior like this, you may not have all the details, and in fact, we expect that you will not have all the details. An individual will just tell you one aspect of a behavior they experienced. Importantly, as I've mentioned, it's not your job to investigate it. Instead, all we ask is that you interpret it and look at what the behavior is. And if you think that someone is telling you, my partner did X to me, or my spouse did Y to me, or the guy I've been living with did X to me, all of that could be something in which you need to report to the Title IX team. And in fact, I would suggest that you default to reporting to the Title IX team, because all it is a call. You call the Title IX team and then they get a second set of eyes on it. They may tell you that this does not rise to the level of violating the policy. They may tell you that it doesn't implicate the policy at all. Or they may say, thank you for telling us. Let's see if we can have a communication ourselves with the individual and how can we help them. The final behavior that's highlighted here is retaliation. Retaliation is any act or word that constitutes intimidation or threat or coercion because of a person's report of behavior defined in this policy. So how might this look? This might be a scenario in which you are an employee here, and you know that one of your other employees is suffering from any form of sexual misconduct we just discussed. You might say, I'm going to go and tell the Title IX team because that's what I received into my training in. And you tell your supervisor on your way to walk over to Nick or Ashley's office. And on your walk, your supervisor said, well, great, thank you for telling me, but you know what? If you're going to go report this behavior, you can keep on walking because your employment here has ended, or you lost your leadership opportunity, or you don't have some other benefit that you would otherwise be entitled to here. That is retaliation. That is retaliation or punishment for you taking an act that you're entitled to do. That's inappropriate and it violates this policy. Next, you have to understand, well, what is the process? What will happen once I make a report? Typically, once you make a report, the Title IX team, Nick or Ashley, will speak with the complainant directly, and they'll ask for further information. Again, you don't need to ask for this information. That's Nick or Ashley's job because they are trained, they're expert in this. They can ask the questions in an appropriate way, depending on the circumstances. And then they'll make a decision. Does the reported behavior implicate the conservatory's sexual misconduct policy? That word implicate is important. It doesn't say, does the reported behavior violate the policy, because that's not what they can decide at that point. All they know is the base outlines, and they're trying to figure out, does it involve sexual misconduct? In many ways, they're trying to answer the same question you are, but they're doing it with much more information. So view them not as an oversight agency or someone who's going to oversee what you're doing, but as a second set of eyes, a person that could tell you, I think what you're saying doesn't necessarily rise to the level, or thank you for bringing this to my attention. We can work with this case. This is a sexual misconduct issue. They can also make decisions about confidentiality or privacy. In a few moments, we're going to talk much more about confidentiality or privacy, but the bottom line is you as a responsible employee cannot provide an assurance of confidentiality because that's an institutional decision. And there are instances that I'll talk about in which the institution has to act to protect the safety of the larger community, not necessarily just the safety of the individual. If an investigation is required, and it won't always be required, but if it is required, the process is that both parties will be notified and investigators will be selected. But one thing you likely cannot do is what the Title IX team can, and that's provide an interim measure, a measure that's designed to preserve the status quo and keep people safe while the investigation is pending. There are many different types of interim measures, and they range from no contact orders, keeping parties separate that way, separating them in their living circumstances, separating them in their academic circumstances, or even potentially separating them in their employment circumstance. So making sure that people aren't working in an overnight shift with someone who is sexually abusing them. It also is an opportunity for the conservatory to share with the individual what services and resources they have available. And that includes advocacy services, that includes other supports, other accommodations that can be provided. For example, speaking with counseling, reporting to law enforcement, getting the help and assistance that an individual who's experiencing this behavior needs to maintain their ability to work or live or learn here at the conservatory. If an investigation is needed, if the Title IX team decides that the policy is implicated and it necessitates an investigation, the investigators will be chosen from various places. They could be internal, or they could be external people, or it could be a combination of both. The important thing is that they have to be qualified and well-trained. And what that means is they have to be qualified to do a prompt, impartial, and thorough investigation. They have to be trained in certain things that may come up. For example, individuals who experience trauma often process things and think about things differently. There's an entire body of research that focuses on what trauma does to an individual and how that may change the way they respond. Individuals who investigate these cases will be trained on how to ask questions so as not to re-victimize individuals and so they can understand the information that they are getting from them. They're also trained to make sure they give a fair shake to both parties. Importantly, the policy states that if there's a conflict, that both parties can point that out. So for example, if one of the investigators is someone that they grew up with, that would be an inappropriate person to investigate the behavior. Once the investigation begins, the investigator will then reach out to the parties to schedule an interview. An important thing that the conservatory really wanted to come out through this process is that it be fair to both sides. And so both sides have an opportunity to share their story, including the consistencies and inconsistencies that they see or experience in the other person's story. They're allowed to present witnesses. They're allowed to share documentary evidence or electronic evidence, and they may give the investigators the opportunity to talk to other people or learn about other people. All of those things are designed to make sure that both parties' information and experiences can be fully shared with the investigators, who then will draft an investigative report. The parties then have an opportunity to review that report and draft a response. Importantly, the investigators do not make the decision as to responsibility or sanction. The Title IX coordinator makes that decision, and he's an internal person. The law requires that both parties typically be given notice of the outcome at the same time, and so the conservatory will follow all laws in making sure that they do so. There may be instances, however, when information cannot be shared because of privacy rights, in which case the institution will share the information that's necessary and legally required to be shared. Finally, there's an appeal process. If a party feels that they were treated unfairly throughout this process, there's two grounds for them to appeal. First, if there's a procedural error that significantly impacted the outcome of the investigation. Second, if there's newly discovered material information that was not available which could change decision of responsibility or sanction. Those are two relatively limited grounds for appeal, but they're important grounds. If someone is not getting the benefit of this process that's designed to be fair, or if new information comes to light after the decision has already been made, the conservatory wants to make clear that those individuals can come forward and can appeal. You work in a very specific and unique scenario here at the conservatory, insofar as not only do you work with adults and young adults, but through the PrEP program, you also could potentially work with children. So it's necessary to tell you that you are also obligated under a separate state law. This is separate from the conservatory's policy, but what it states under Section 51A is that you are a mandatory reporter. And as a mandatory reporter, you have an obligation to report to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families if anyone under the age of 18 is suffering from physical or emotional injury resulting from various circumstances, and that includes sexual abuse or neglect. The law states that you must report, and you must report to the Department of Children and Families. If you don't, there can be fines and there can be criminal penalties. Now, the benefit of the conservatory's policy is if you learn of any of this behavior, they're asking you to report to them. So when you report to the conservatory and you tell them, listen, this is a person who's in the PrEP program, they're 14 years old, you can then also work with the conservatory to make sure that you satisfy your requirements under 51A and provide the appropriate reporting to the Department of Children and Families. I mentioned something earlier about providing confidentiality versus privacy. And I impart to you, and I do so in a very strong manner because this comes up a lot. You cannot provide or assure an individual of confidentiality, and there's a reason for that. As I mentioned, the law is really concerned with making sure that the entire campus is safe. All of the community members are safe. And so an individual might come to you and they might say, I need to share something with you, but I don't want you to act. And that historically is what has happened, and that has allowed much of this inappropriate behavior to remain in the shadows. The institution may grant confidentiality, but they need to look at certain factors first. Some of those factors include the nature of the offense. They need to look at whether or not there was violence when committing the offense. They also need to look at pattern behavior, whether drugs or alcohol used, were there date rape drugs used, was it a dangerous location, was a weapon used? All of those things are indicators that perhaps this is a broader safety concern, and in those situations, the conservatory cannot turn a blind eye. And that's why you cannot promise confidentiality, because when you report, the conservatory may need to take action. And if you've promised that individual confidentiality, they may be surprised when the director of human resources or someone from the dean of students office contacts them to talk with them. And they're going to be mad at one person, you, because you're the person that said you would treat it confidentiality. So I really press upon you, do not assure confidentiality. That is an institutional decision, and it's an institutional decision that requires a lot more knowledge about the factors at play. It may be that an individual comes to you and says, this was a one-off situation, I don't want it to go further. But when you report it to the Title IX team, they might inform you that we've actually received several complaints about one of these individuals before. And maybe this is part of a broader pattern. In those circumstances, the conservatory will be forced to act because they need to make sure that this campus is safe. So let's work through an exercise. Imagine a student comes to your office hours and asks you to tell you something personal. You offer to help however you can. He then states that he's been dating another New England Conservatory student for about a year. They live together, but the relationship has become stressful with graduation approaching. The student tells you that recently his partner has been very demanding with regard to sex and has become physical with him. The student does not say the words rape or sexual misconduct. Rather, he asks if there are resources on campus. What should you do? Should you investigate the behavior? No. You've heard several times you're not charged with investigating. Instead, what your obligation is to report. Now, no, the student never said the word rape or sexual misconduct or stalking or relationship violence. They may not know those terms. They may not come to terms with those terms, even though they have been trained on them. So it's inherent upon you to understand what the behavior is and understand when you need to report. Once you report, the next step that happens is then the Title IX team will have a much broader conversation with the individual and determine whether or not the complaint potentially violates the policy or potentially implicates the policy. It's at that point that the institution can make a decision about confidentiality. They can make a determination about, based on the facts, of whether or not this is something that they can give confidentiality in or whether they cannot. Importantly, while you are a responsible employee, and most employees here are, there are confidential resources that I've mentioned. Counseling is a confidential resource. I encourage you, if you have a student or if you're working with students or employees and they want to keep something confidential, tell them before they disclose to you that there are these people on campus. You also have the policy to help you. The policy defines relationship violence, and the reason that I spent time going through some of those definitions was so you could understand what those definitions are and use them just to determine whether or not this falls under the sexual misconduct policy. Importantly, it's not your job to investigate. It's the job of someone else. You don't need to determine if the behavior is true or not. If it's a rumor, if it's secondhand or thirdhand, again, that's not your requirement to figure out that it has to be firsthand information. All you need to do is report. It may be that someone suffered from sexually inappropriate behavior and they don't feel comfortable coming forward, but they tell their roommate. Their roommate may decide to disclose, and at that point, the institution will be obliged to take some further steps. Again, they would talk to the person who's complaining about the behavior, but you don't need to make those decisions on the front end. Instead, you just need to make sure that the Title IX team understands what you know. Let's work on another example. You've been working extensively with a student to prepare her for an upcoming performance. During a break, the student takes a phone call. Upon her return, it looks like she's been crying, so you ask if she's okay. She tells you that she's fine, but she just got a call to learn that she has returned to her hometown in California to testify against someone who sexually assaulted her when she was in high school. The student states that the timing could not be worse in regard to her upcoming performance, and the prosecutor in California has been very demanding of her time. What should you do? The respondent, the accused, is based in California. There's already a prosecutor involved. Should you report? Yes. Even though the institution may be limited in what it can do, it may be able to help. It may be able to help the complainant. It may be able to help that student who has to testify. It may be able to provide her resources or counseling or academic accommodations, something to make it easier for her to live through this difficult time. Similarly, she may have said that this happened in California, but you don't know the whole story. Maybe the partner also matriculated here at the conservatory or plans to matriculate here at the conservatory. All of that information should be known so that the conservatory can do its very best to make sure that it keeps people safe. Now, I'm often asked, how do I do this myself when I'm in your role? How do I create this understanding with my students or my colleagues who I have a very close mentoring relationship with? And I agree that is going to be one of the most difficult things that you have to do. The way that I do it is I put a notice in my syllabus when I'm teaching. And I say right up front, at the first day of class, I am a responsible employee under my institution's definition of what that means. And so what that means is that you as a student, if you tell me something that involves sexual misconduct here on the campus, or involving someone from the campus, or involving anything else that involves you or another person in sexual misconduct, I don't have an option. I have to report it. Because I teach in the area of higher education law, we often have a class about sexual misconduct. So I'll remind them about that again before that class, so they understand fully what my responsibility is. Now, some people have asked and said, well, this will chill our relationship. And it may. But what you're trying to do here is you're trying to give information to the person who needs it. You're trying to make it clear that the person who has been impacted by this behavior holds the power. They're the ones that can decide to tell you once they know that you're a responsible employee. As long as they know the consequences of what has to happen if they tell you, then that's okay. They can make an informed choice. Similarly, they can be informed that there are confidential resources on campus, and if they choose to, they can go there. The student at that point may opt not to tell you. Your colleague may opt not to tell you what happened, and that is their prerogative. It's their decision. Until you learn about the behavior, until you learn some specific piece of information, even if it's not firsthand, you don't necessarily have an obligation to report. But if you're at all questioning about this, if you're at all questioning about any scenario, I encourage you to ask Nick or Ashley, the Title IX team, before this behavior arises, before you learn about it. You don't want a situation in which a student does not understand your role and he or she blurts out to you something terrible that happened to them. Even if they want it confidential, at that point, it's too late. You need to report, and there does need to be some level of process that happens. While the conservatory will certainly be sensitive as possible to that individual, there may be instances, as I've mentioned, in which they have to act for the safety of the larger community. The next area I want to talk about is boundary challenges. And I asked to talk about this, and I want to talk about this with you because in my experience as an investigator working in this field, I see that many of the inappropriate behaviors that I see, particularly involving faculty, often happen because of power imbalances. The conservatory's policy has a dedicated section in which it tells you exactly what are considered inappropriate behaviors and inappropriate relationships here at the conservatory, and I encourage you all to read that, both so you can understand how to distinguish when an improper relationship is happening, and also so you can keep yourself out of those improper relationships. The teacher-student relationships are never allowed. But there are also other things that play into this. You have to consider the age and the maturity and the experience of the students that you have in front of you. Many students might come here from high schools or other schools in which they were not part of the in crowd, they were not part of the popular group, and they come here and they see that everyone here is like them. Everyone here celebrates art and music just the way they do, and so that blurs the lines for them. They say, not only do I have wonderful professors, but my professors are my friends. My advisors are my friends. And so that might make it difficult for them to understand how that relationship should work. Similarly, you have to understand how your own power might impact them. If you're a professor of a student, you may tell jokes in front of the class, and the students will laugh even if they're terrible jokes. Why are they laughing? They're laughing because you are in a position of authority over them. You are either assessing them or grading them or giving them some sort of career opportunity. Maybe you're yourself a very accomplished musician, and you can connect them with someone in the industry that will give them their break. These are the sort of things we saw happening in Hollywood. If you want this part, if you want to perform in this production, all you need to do is X. That is inappropriate. And you have to understand where you stand in that relationship, as well as the age and maturity and the experience of the people you're working with, so there can be no miscommunication here. While I gave a silly and simple example of telling jokes in front of a class, it can happen in other ways that are more troubling. Maybe you ask the individual out to coffee, or maybe you ask them out to dinner, or maybe you ask them to come to your house. You might have a completely innocent reason for doing that and a completely appropriate reason for doing that. But understand that they may be saying yes, not necessarily because they want to come to dinner with you, but because they feel pressured because of your power over them. Another area that I commonly see problems relates to power imbalances, and that is poor boundary settings. Again, you have a very specific relationship with many of the people you work with, whether it's a colleague, supervisor-colleague relationship, or a student-teacher relationship. And those boundaries can become challenging particularly if you are working with them outside of regular hours. If you're a musician and they're a musician and you're playing together at a bar, that's going to become blurry. If your supervisor is asking you to grab drinks after work, that can become blurry. So I implore you to really think through the boundaries that you set with students, the boundaries you set with your employees and your colleagues, and make clear that those are boundaries that you and the conservatory are comfortable with. A big way that this comes out is through communications nowadays. Now, communications have become more and more informal, whether it's text messaging or social media messaging or any other form of messaging. It's more informal, it's more instantaneous, and it can be shared without context. So text messaging often becomes the issue here. While it might be totally appropriate to communicate with a professor or a faculty member via email, texting just feels different. It shows up on your phone, it's instantaneous, there's more room for miscommunication, and if you don't draw appropriate boundaries, you can really see this go in a way you might not like to see it. Maybe it starts with the student texting you something very innocent, something very innocuous. But then they start texting you when they go to a bar and they say, hey, look at this instrument someone is playing here at this bar. But then they keep texting you pictures. And now it's pictures of them drinking. Maybe it's pictures of them dancing or behaving in other ways that as their professor, you really don't want to be a part of. Similarly, they can go both ways. They can invite you to share parts of your life with them through your social and public personas. Again, be very careful about whether or not you really want a friend, a colleague, a student, or someone like that having access to that aspect of your life. The third category I occasionally see is bad actors. But bad actors are where people think when you talk about boundaries. They say it must be someone who intentionally was doing this bad thing. In fact, they're a relatively small group, and they behave in predatory ways. They choose vulnerable students as targets, and they test their limits by using different grooming techniques. Grooming is the idea that an individual is going to continually press the limits to see how far they can go. It might start with an inappropriate joke. It might start with a sexually charged story. And they're just trying to see a response. And then it might elevate to a touch on the hand, a touch on the arm. And then it's a hug. And then it's a kiss on the cheek. And then it might be saying, hey, why don't you talk to me about these things? Talk to me about these personal issues. Don't go to your family. Don't go to your friends. I'm your support network. What are they trying to do? They're trying to push the boundaries. They're trying to get you potentially in a sexually inappropriate situation. And once they get you there, their grooming techniques have a double purpose. Now they say, oh, you want to tell on me? Great. Well, you're complicit in this. You took part in this. You were part of those text messages. You allowed me to hug you. You allowed me to kiss you. You maybe even consented to the behavior. Again, looking back to the conservatory's policies, certain relationships are not allowed, regardless of how they get them there. Bad actors are not a big majority of the people that I see. And in fact, there's a fair bit of research that says most people are not bad actors. Most people don't commit sexual assault. So the reason that I'm telling you about this is because you are best positioned to notice if this behavior is happening. And if you see this behavior, you need to inform the Title IX team, even if you just suspect it. Because once you tell them, they may say, well, thank you for sharing with us. We'll keep this on our radar. Or they may tell you, you know what? Thank you for sharing this with us. We've actually heard several things about this employee. And you're just one more person, but maybe you give it a little more specificity. At that point, the institution can act. They can't act until they know the information, but once they're able to act, that's when they can decide what's appropriate, and if it's appropriate, how do we separate this bad actor from our community to keep people safe? There are common behaviors that are commonly seen to create risky situations. There are things like physical contact that can be misinterpreted, inappropriate self-disclosure, people who just want to overshare, encouraging dependence, and asking people to entrust secrets or overly personal information. Again, not all of these behaviors are bad by themselves, but in the improper context, they could be evidence of sexual misconduct. Creating special relationships, inviting students to sensitive personal places where you go, your home, places where you socialize, using inappropriate emails or text messaging or social media, and finally, flirting or inappropriate touching or lewd or sexual jokes. Virtually all of those final category are things that are probably not going to be allowed depending on the relationship between the parties. You have some unique challenges here at the conservatory. Some things that you do here as a matter of practice I would never allow at any other institution. For example, if I'm working with a student in a math program or a science program or an English program, and they told me that their professor put their hand on their diaphragm, I would instantly say, wait a sec, what's happening? That's not appropriate. But here, if you're giving a voice lesson, you might have to do that. You might have to touch even lower. You might need to adjust fingers. You might need to adjust legs or other limbs around an instrument. You might need to manually manipulate someone. All of those things in other contexts could be inappropriate. They could be very appropriate here, but there's an important principle that you need to follow, and that is respect. And how does respect look in this context? First, you need to ask permission before any physical touching and wait for student confirmation. That second part is important. Don't just ask and then do. Ask and wait for the answer. And then respect that answer. Respect that individual's boundaries and try to figure out how you can work around any challenges they may have. They may be uncomfortable having you touch them because of your gender, in which case, okay, we can have a different gendered faculty member work with them. Or they may be something that you can do to change your educational approach so you can make this individual feel more comfortable. There's many workarounds for this sort of situation, but the important thing is you have to understand where the student or the employee feels and whether or not they consent to the behavior. Now, individuals have asked me in the course of some of these training sessions, wait a second, I touch a student's fingers or hands 15, 20, 50 times during a lesson. Does that mean I need to ask consent for each of those touches? And the answer is no, not necessarily. We need to use some common sense here. What is important in that situation is to explain to the person, the student or the employee, how are you going to be touching them and why? Is it relevant? Is it necessary? Is it something that you feel is part of instructing them in their instrument? Share that information with them so they understand why is it that you're doing it and what the process is going to look like moving forward. It might be that at the first lesson you establish the appropriate grounds. But importantly, if you leave those grounds, if you've gotten permission to touch fingers or limbs, that's acceptable. That might be fine. But if then there's an instance where you need to touch a chest or a diaphragm or another body part to instruct the student, that would be another point where I would stop and I would ask permission. I would say, hey, this is a different type of touching than you're used to. Here's why I'm doing it. If you teach underage students, if you teach in the prep school, it's even more important that you do this both with the student and also with their parent. So the parent has an understanding of what your expectations are and they have a good sense of what's appropriate and what's not going to be appropriate in that context. Again, if they say no, that ends the conversation and you should just seek to try to find another way to instruct that student. Now, when I travel and I consult with institutions, many institutions have different things they do, and I always talk to them about understanding their role. You have to understand what's your role, what is the student's expectation of that role, and what is the context. A safety measure that I use in my own teaching, in my own work, is this. If my supervisor or my partner asks me about the conduct, could I explain it without being embarrassed? What if someone else described the conduct to you? Would you be troubled by it? If you're embarrassed, if you're ashamed, if there's some reason why you would not want to share that conduct with either a supervisor or a partner or a spouse, then you should rethink whether or not you've established an appropriate boundary. I always ask the institutions I work with to identify the risky situations that they may be part of and really try to minimize the risk of boundary erosion. Some examples that I use are going to be very clear to people here. I say extracurricular activities are really important to think about. Theater and music. Well, that's exactly what you do here at the conservatory. Why are they risky? Well, because sometimes you play together with your faculty, with your colleagues. You play at bars. You play your instrument at bars. You sing at bars. You go to late night rehearsals. You might be part of a performance in which you're wearing less clothing than would typically be appropriate in this context. All of that stuff can be appropriate, but it's just a situation that creates heightened risk because that's when boundaries can erode. When you're on field trips or group travel, when you're traveling out of the country for a special event, all of those situations are situations in which people are often tempted to let down their guard, lower their boundaries, but doing so can really have very challenging results. This chart that's on the presentation right now is just a chart to help you think about the different forms of conduct and the different ways that that can be appropriate or inappropriate in different roles. Many of you are teachers here, and in that teaching role, you might be teaching a lecture hall format. Are there ever situations in which private one-on-one meetings are appropriate? Absolutely. That's what office hours are for. What about physical touching in that context? Again, I shared the example before about the lecture hall situation in which a math teacher is teaching a math lesson. There's very little justification that I can think of for why they would need to physically touch a student. But in that teaching situation, you may ask to touch a student, maybe to demonstrate to the rest of the class. If that happens, is it appropriate? Did you get the consent to do that? And how did you do it? Those are the important questions. Now, importantly, look across the bar. Look across the chart to see that there are certain situations in which physical touching may be questionable if you're a teacher, but as a private lesson teacher or a coach, you may be teaching them, and very appropriately. We've worked through this before. All this chart does is give you the right questions to ask as your situations and your conduct changes. Importantly, these are just samples. You can create your own forms of conduct and your own different roles that you have. The important part is just thinking ahead, thinking through the questions you may ask, situations you may find yourself in trying to make sure you're establishing a relationship that is healthy. Let's do a final example. Professor Parker gives out his email and personal cell phone number on his syllabus and encourages the students to let him know if they're going to be late for class or practice. Gradually, students start texting Professor Parker more frequently than they email him. It started as a notice that a student was going to be late for class. Stop right there. Think about that for yourself. How many would feel uncomfortable if a student texted them that they were going to be late for a class? I would probably be comfortable with that, personally. Let's continue. 2 students texted him to ask if he wanted them to pick up a cup of coffee for him while they were at Starbucks. Professor Parker said yes, but only if he could pay for all the drinks. Let's stop again. Did your answer change? Are you comfortable with this text message? The text message from 2 students asking to pick up a cup of coffee for Professor Parker? If your answer is anything like what I've seen in other sessions, some people are comfortable with this and some people are not comfortable with it. Some people are comfortable because they like coffee and they want that cup of coffee. Some of them are uncomfortable because Professor Parker is paying for the drinks. Whatever their reason, this is where a lot of people start having mixed opinions about what they think is appropriate or inappropriate. Let's move on. After this example, where the 2 students bought him coffee, now students regularly text him to share links from the music they hear or to share other fun facts or details of their lives with him. Let's pause again. Are you comfortable with this form of text messaging? Some people have said, I'm comfortable if they share links from the music because that's what we do here at the conservatory. And so I want to know what they're listening to. Okay, great. But they draw the line at sharing details of their lives. They don't necessarily want to get their details of their students' personal lives through a text message. And so they may say, hey, let's move this to email, or let's move this to an in-person conversation. But they don't want to create a situation in which they're texting back and forth. One day, one of the students, Laura, texts Professor Parker to ask him if he wanted a cup of coffee. Professor Parker said he would love one, but he's actually working from home today because he has a cold. Laura responds that she lives in the same neighborhood and could drop off some chicken soup. Before Professor Parker can reply, he hears the bell ring and Laura is at the door. Now, if your response to this is anything like every other session we've had, everyone starts shaking their head no at this point. This is not what they want to happen. This is not a scenario they want to be involved in. They don't want a student showing up at their house with chicken soup. Maybe it's kind, maybe it's totally innocent, but they just don't like the optics of that. That changes the nature of their relationship. But you know what? I don't blame Laura in this situation. Laura emailed him or texted him, and she offered to do something for him that she had seen other students do. So she was not necessarily inappropriate in that regard. The importance of this, and the reason I use this example, is to make clear to you that the reason Laura behaved the way she did, the reason that she texted him about the cup of coffee and ultimately showed up at his door with a cup of chicken soup, is because Professor Parker had let down his boundary with the first students who texted him to ask if he wanted a cup of coffee. That set a precedent. That set a precedent for Laura, who may be young, who may be inexperienced, who may be away from home for the first time and just looking for a friend or an advisor or a mentor. Professor Parker has established what his boundary was, and his boundary was eroded. As a result, now he's in a position that he's not comfortable with. Again, the biggest thing you can do to help prevent this behavior is think through your interactions with your students, with your colleagues, with the people that work for you, and make sure that you're completely above board in all that you do. Finally, I keep referring to the Title IX team, and they are the true resources on campus. Nick Mackey and Ashley Carter are the place to go if you have questions about this process, questions about the policy, or if you find yourself in a situation in which you just don't know the answer. They're designed to be resources for you. They're designed to be a team to support you. The bottom line of this training is that sexual misconduct cannot be allowed to exist here at the conservatory. And to the extent it does, the conservatory needs to make sure that individuals who are suffering it get the resources they need, are able to operate and work and live and learn in a safe environment, and that they are cared for. Thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions about this presentation or the policy or the process, please direct them to Nick Mackey or Ashley Carter at the contact information here.